So let's give a quick overview of the Supra. Okay, it's story time, guys. Settle in. We'll play the game when we play the game, but it's settling in for story time quick about the old Supra. The car is not home yet, no. It still needs exhaust. So anyway, bought the car something like 4 years ago now. And, yeah, grab your snacks, settle in, turn the lights out, get your popcorn. So bought the car about 4 years ago. It had a 7M GTE that was pretty heavily modified. And, it was really fast. It was really fast. But the 7M GTE engine, not known for its reliability. And over time, it started to overheat. And it would overheat really only if you was hard on it. If you were hard on the car. If you just drove it to the shops and didn't do burnouts and highway pulls, it was fine. But it was slowly starting to overheat, which meant the head gasket was going bad again. And so I kind of had the opportunity to do one of two things. I could have either rebuilt the quite modified 7M GTE, maintained my power, maintained all the mods, whatever, but still had a 7M GTE, which is, again, more prone to reliability issues. Or I could engine swap. And I went back and forth on that for months. Months and months and months. And eventually decided, you know what? If I'm going to drop a bunch of money on this, I may as well... 4JZ, there you go. Look, now Twitch can count. I figured I may as well swap if I'm going to drop a lot of money in this. This car's only going to be cool, you know. If I'm going to drop all this money, I may as well make the car cool. So, I bought a 1JZ, a VVTi, which a lot of you guys already know a lot of this, but bought a JZ, 1JZ VVTi out of a Verosa, out of a JZX 110 from Japan, and already had a 154 transmission, which is good, and started the swap. And I actually got the old engine out fairly easily. And so I was feeling good. I was feeling confident because the old engine came out in a weekend. It was no issue. There was a full step-by-step written guide. It was a piece of cake. Got the old engine out and was like, all right, well, now it's time to work on the new engine. And that's where things got kind of scary. Because I was doing a lot of engine work I've never done before. Pretty much rebuilding the engine outside of the short block. Pretty much rebuilding everything on the outside of the engine. Full new harness, bunch of new sensors, new oil pan and feed system, fully rebuilt transmission. A lot of I had to completely redo the coolant lines, redo a lot of oil lines with the turbo. Basically everything had to be redone on the outside of the engine. And that took me a whole year to do. Because there's 5 different 1JZs, and some of them are just so simple. And some of them are not at all. 1JZ ain't hard, try BMW stuff. I have worked on BMWs. Let me tell you, this 1JZ, very hard. Because this 1JZ is much different than the other 1JZs. This is the newest 1JZ, the JZX 110 VVTi. And they do a lot of stupid stuff on it. Which was cool for the early 2000s, but nowadays we've figured out better ways to handle it. But anyway, got the car in. Yeah, VVT stuff makes things very complicated. The throttle body is also really stupidly complicated. And there was just so much that had to be done. There was just so much that had to be done to the engine that I had just never done before. So that took me a while, and then it was a huge pain getting the engine back in, but it started first try, which was like a huge accomplishment. Literally the first time I tried to start the new engine in the car, started right up, and that's where you get this from. No fucking way! That sound clip is me, because I was just testing the fuel pump. I was just like, let's see if the fuel pump gets power. And then it was like, wah, and I was like, ah, it works. So I was pretty stoked. And then I was like, okay, cool. The engine runs. I'm going to start putting parts back on it. Yeah, that was very real excitement. And my wife was there too. My wife was there, and like the dogs were outside, and she didn't expect it to turn over. I didn't expect it to turn over, and I was just like, ah! What's the new engine from again? A Verosa, JZX 110, either or. But yeah, Verosa's like the name. But anyway, started right away. I was super stoked. So started like putting the engine back together, getting all the intercooler, all that stuff on. It didn't have any clutch fluid or a working clutch, so I had to make that all work. And then I started to notice that it wouldn't stay running. The engine wouldn't stay running. It would run, but it would always die after a small period of time. And I just kept thinking, it's like, okay, well, I'm missing something obvious here. Because again, I would, test it. And I'd be like, oh, well, I must be like missing some vacuum line, or I must be missing some sensor. But as I kept putting parts on the car, and eventually I finished it, and it actually worked worse than when it worked when I first turned it over. Yeah, I forgot about the banana in the tailpipe, right? So, so I was like, what is going on? Like, why did the car run well when it had like no cooling, no sensors plugged in, huge vacuum leaks, like nothing was working on the car. I didn't even have like power steering, alternator, like there wasn't even a belt. And I was like, why is this getting messed up? Why is this running worse now that I have more parts installed on the engine? So I went through and did all the basic stuff, and I for, again, about another year, tried to troubleshoot things with the engine. And every night, I would be Googling and forum searching and thinking of ideas. The next morning, I'd go out and I'd try it, or I'd order the part and try it next week, thinking, this must be it. This is the problem. And it never was. You're right, I was low on blinker fluid. Yeah, spoilers. I fixed so much stuff on that car, and I never got it to run. And it's good that I did all that stuff. Like, I can't be too upset, because there were a lot of little nagging issues. Like, I had little gaskets that had small leaks. I had, like, little vacuum switching valves that weren't working how they should. I had a couple bad sensors. I had a couple things that were wired kind of jankily. So I did do a lot of good work to the car. But it just wouldn't stay running, which just doesn't make sense. Like, cars don't need a lot to run. They might run poorly, but cars don't need a lot to run. They need fuel, oil, or fuel, air, and spark. That's it. And my car had all those. So I was like, what's going on? I even like unplugged the fuel line and like dumped fuel into a bucket. It was spurting fuel. I checked the spark on every spark plug, replaced all the spark plugs, looked at all the coil packs. I redid the timing. I changed the VVTi gear. I bought a smoke tester and smoke tested for vacuum leaks. I did compression tests as well. I rented a compression tester, tested each cylinder, which by the way was done already before I bought the engine. But I did like literally everything you can do, and it just wouldn't stay running. Now again, part of the issue is that this 1JZ is an extremely complicated engine. because it's like, it was like when they were trying to do a bunch of technologically advanced stuff, but they just weren't technologically advanced enough to do it. So like, again, I was talking about the throttle, okay? There's generally two ways to manage your throttle. Now, what your throttle is, effectively, in every car, is a little butterfly valve. It's a little circle inside of a tube, and the more you press the gas, the more it turns that circle, which lets in more air. That's pretty much all your throttle does. And there's two ways you can control that. One is with a throttle cable. And that's how every old car did it. So there is a physical cable running from your gas pedal to a little spring, basically, to that gear, to that valve. And the more you press the pedal, the more it pulls the string, and the more it opens the intake. So that's pretty simple, right? Now, new cars are what's called drive-by-wire. In new cars, there's a sensor in the pedal, and that communicates to a computer, and then the computer adjusts how the valve opens. Now, that's better for some reasons because they can kind of tweak things based on like how fast you're already going, how rich the air is. Like they can tweak things, and that's fine. The 1JZ VVTi, the ETCSI version, has both. It has both, which is extremely complicated because you still have a mechanical throttle cable that goes up to the engine and turns a little gear, but that little gear doesn't do anything. That little gear just talks to a computer right on the other side of the throttle body. And that has like this like watch gear system that like reduces the signal, and then there's a little motor, and then the little motor talks to a thing, and then that does that. But then the cable at the last 20% switches over. At the last 20% of the actual mechanical cable, you have actual movement. So it's like two extremely complex systems that are communicating with each other, and it's so stupid. It's so stupid. So I spent a lot of time working on that because I thought that must be what's wrong. I also spent a lot of time working on the timing because there's no good guide for doing timing on this engine, because this is the problem. Again, you have basically three major versions of the 1JZ. There's like a standard 1JZ, a 1JZ VVTi ETCS, and a 1JZ VVTi ETCSI. And I have that one. And then you have the 2JZ. And there's like three different versions of the 2JZ, because there's 2JZ that are not, there's non-turbo and turbo, and then there's VVTi and non-VVTi. And there's just not enough resources specifically for my 1JZ. And everyone's like, well, no, just time it off of this engine. Time it how you time a normal 1JZ. But you can't do that because it doesn't have a VVTi gear or a VVT gear, whatever. And then people are like, oh, time it off a 2JZ. So I must have redone the timing on that engine like 3 times because everyone has a different way of doing it. Anyway, what this is all coming around to is I elicited help from a bunch of different, very knowledgeable 1JZ guys. None of them could figure out what was wrong. I scoured the forums. I posted my own stuff. None of them could figure out what was wrong. I'm not an idiot. I couldn't figure out what was wrong. So I was like, all right, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take it in to a shop, which I had done. I did this entire swap by myself. No one touched that engine besides me. I was very proud of that. But I was like, screw it. I'm taking it to a shop. Because maybe there is something stupid I'm missing. And if not, then like I guess I'll be proud of myself. But if so, then whatever. Who cares? I have a running car again. So I took it into the shop. They found a couple little things that were wrong. Whatever. Wasn't a big deal. And they still couldn't get it running. So they had my car for 7 months. I took my Supra to them 7 months ago, January 10th. is when I took it. When I took it in, January 10th. Now, to their credit, they didn't work on it like every day for 7 months. I told them, I was like, hey, no huge rush on this. I'd just like the car back by like spring to summer so I can do other stuff to the car. And they're like, yeah, no worries. Anyway, 7 months they had the car and they couldn't figure it out either. So at this point, I'm like, what do I do? I have a Supra with a 1JZ and it's worthless to me because I can't drive this stupid thing. And no one can figure out how to get it to run. They talked to Toyota techs. They talked to the guy who did my harness. They talked to like specialist shops. No one could figure it out. So finally they said, okay. We chatted over email and they said, we're going to take it in one more time. And if we can't figure it out, we're just going to give you the car back. And I was like, shoot. Okay. So that was August 1st, just a couple days ago. So I've never really driven it on this engine. No, the furthest I had driven the JZ was from the bottom of my garage up to the top of the garage and from the bottom of my driveway up to the top of my driveway into my garage. Because I tested the clutch when I did the clutch. And that's it. So I've never driven it for more than like 45 seconds. But anyway, so they said, okay, on the 1st, we're going to work on it. We're going to do a full day. We're going to do a full day working on this thing, working on this car. And if we can't figure it out, we're giving you the car back. I'm like, okay. And I kind of offhandedly was like, well, how about I come in and help? Because I'm no mechanical expert, but I do know my way around that engine, and I know what I've tried, and I know what I haven't tried, and I know how to Google things. And they were like, yeah, sure. Come on in. So I was like, okay. So Monday morning, I went in, and I just started working on my own car in their bay with one of the other guys. And he was working on the timing, he was verifying the timing, and I was working on the throttle body. And we ended up getting it, and it still wasn't running with the couple things we tried. And I'm like, all right, well, I'm going to do some research. You do some research. We did some more research. We tried a couple more things. Still, no luck. It just turned over, would rev for like a couple seconds and then die. And so then I'm like, all right, let's go back to basics again here. Let's confirm that it has fuel, air, and spark. So we went through, checked everything, and found out that it seemed to be starving itself of fuel. So we were like, what's going on here? We know that the fuel system works. We know the fuel pump gets power. So what's killing the fuel pump? And why is it like intermittent? Why does sometimes it work for like a minute? Sometimes, like again, I drove the car for like a minute. No, it would sputter out and die, Beatles, if you tried to rev it for too long. But it was so intermittent. Sometimes it would last 5 seconds. Sometimes it would last 45. And you're going to understand all of this when I tell you what was really wrong. Because let me tell you, it's the stupidest thing. What it was. I'll get into how I figured this out. So I was like, okay, I'm going to check all the wiring on the fuel pump. Because I had modded the fuel pump to give it more power. Because it's a Walbro 255, which can supply more fuel. So I had checked all the wiring. Was using a voltage meter and everything. And I thought about ECU. That was actually, Rune, that was what I was going to do if I couldn't get it to work. Was I was just going to go with another ECU. Because I thought maybe the ECU was bad. But I was told, I opened up the ECU, checked all the capacitors. Everything looked fine. The shops did the same thing. And I was told repeatedly that although original JZ ECUs are notorious for going bad, my JZ ECU is actually pretty well known for being really reliable. So anyway, check all the lines, and I'm like, yep, everything's good. Like, the fuel pump's getting power, and it's sending fuel to the engine. It just like sputters out at some point, and it doesn't make sense. So I'm like, okay, well, I'm gonna look at a wiring diagram just to make sure. Because like all my wiring was good. And I looked at the wiring diagram, and there was a ground wire that I didn't have. And I was like, huh, that's weird. I know the fuel pump itself was grounded. And I double checked that, and I even like made the ground better. So I was like, well, that's weird. They have another ground up here, somewhere else, because the fuel pump was grounded in the trunk, but there was another ground up towards the engine side. And I was like, I don't know if I have that. So I chased it around, and it said it was a green wire with red striping. And I found a green wire with red striping, and it went to my transmission. And I was like, well, that doesn't make sense. And so I traced this line, and it's just like a neutral safety switch. I'm like, okay, so yeah, everything's fine. It's just a neutral safety switch. No, because there were 2 green wires with red striping, which is a big wiring no-no, by the way. You don't mark 2 wires with the same color, okay? If they do 2 completely different things. You don't do that. So, whoops, just stepped on my subwoofer there. Because I triple checked it, and on literally the 3rd time, I was like, wait a minute. Within the loom, there's 2 different wires coming out of here. And sure enough, I traced the other wire. This is a tiny little wire, like a 18 gauge wire, whatever. Tiny little wire. Tracing it. Follow it from the engine bay into the car, and sure enough, it's just sitting there. It's not plugged into any, hold on, I have a picture. We'll get some physical examples here, or some visual examples rather. Yeah, here we go. Sure enough, all these wires are hooked up. You can actually, so the other green and red wire was over here. This one, oh yeah, 8-bit, you're right. How silly of me. This one was just sitting here. And you can actually see like it's just not plugged into anything. And all this was like tucked away, you know? And I had to, by the way, it didn't look just like this. I had to filter, or I had to pull this out a little bit. Because this wire was just kind of sitting. Now here's the kicker. Well, now we'll get to the resolution here. This is my fuel pump ground wire. The reason that I was having such weird and intermittent issues where sometimes the car would run and sometimes the car wouldn't, and it would run for an indeterminate amount of time, was because this wire was resting against a ground. It was resting against a piece of bare metal in my engine, in my glove box. So there was a loose ground to fuel. And that's why every time we tested everything, all the electrical was fine. It never threw anything weird. But when you would start the car, it would vibrate, it would shake the car, and that ground would disconnect because it was vibrating and it was giving intermittent ground. So only when the car was running did the fuel pump not have ground. And that was the whole problem. 7 months and $3,000 at this shop. And the whole problem was that this wire was just kind of sitting there. And every time you'd turn on the car, it would shake the ground loose. 7 months to fix a shaky wire. Oh, so kids, check your wiring harnesses. And then ran great. I'll be honest, the ecstaticness, the excitement far outweighed the upsetness of spending that much money and that much time to fix this. To fix this. Now, and then literally right after, this was the first attempt at starting it after we did the fuel pump, or after we grounded that wire. Ran fine. Ran fine. Weird. When you ground the fuel pump, the car gets fuel. By the way, this sick Porsche right here. Woo. God, listen to that turbo. That just psst. And then he brings it back. It does need a wash very badly. It's been sitting outside for 7 months. It needs a lot. The car needs a lot now. Anyway, there's that story. The car runs.